Kåfjord, Norway. September 22, 1943. Just before 8:30 in the morning, a stretch of gray Arctic water erupts without warning. No aircraft roar overhead. No torpedo wake slices toward the coast. The battleship Tirpitz, the pride of Nazi Germany's surface fleet, sits at anchor behind 3 rings of anti-torpedo netting, guarded by hydrophones, patrol boats, and thousands of men who believe her utterly untouchable. Then the sea beneath her hull simply lifts. The ship, over 50,000 tons of German steel, is thrown sideways as though shaken by a giant hand. Instruments shatter. Turbines are wrenched from their mountings. Men below decks are hurled from their bunks, and yet no one on board has seen a single enemy vessel. There has been no periscope, no torpedo track, nothing to explain the violence that has just crippled one of the most powerful warships on Earth. The truth, when it eventually emerges, will sound almost too small to be believable. Tirpitz has not been struck by a fleet, or a squadron of bombers, or even a conventional submarine. She has been attacked by something roughly the length of a double-decker bus, crewed by 4 young men folded into a hull barely wide enough to crouch in, who spent the previous 3 days navigating minefields, nets, and patrol lines in total secrecy before laying explosive charges directly beneath her keel and slipping away. This is the story of the X-Craft, Britain's midget submarines, and of the men who took the largest warships in the German Navy and turned them, almost overnight, into liabilities their own commanders no longer trusted. It is a story that rarely gets told with the same reverence as Spitfires or Lancasters, and yet it changed the naval war in the North Atlantic more than most people realize. By the summer of 1943, the Royal Navy had a problem that conventional weapons simply could not solve, and it was a problem with a name: Tirpitz. Sister ship to the Bismarck, she displaced more than 50,000 tons, fully loaded, and carried 8 15-inch guns capable of outranging almost anything the Allies could put against her. She never needed to fight to be dangerous. Simply by existing, moored in the fjords of northern Norway, she tied down a disproportionate share of Britain's naval strength. Home fleet battleships that could have been protecting convoys or supporting operations in the Mediterranean instead sat at Scapa Flow, held in reserve purely in case Tirpitz put to sea. Arctic convoys carrying vital supplies to the Soviet Union had to be escorted as though a fast, heavily armed raider might appear at any moment, because one might. Winston Churchill himself is said to have viewed her destruction as a matter that would affect the whole shape of the naval war, tying down battleships, cruisers, and aircraft that were desperately needed elsewhere, simply to guard against a threat that rarely left port. Conventional attempts to deal with her had already failed, repeatedly and expensively. Bomber Command had tried high-level raids and lost aircraft for negligible results, since Norway's fjords offered natural smoke cover and defenses that made precision bombing almost impossible. Crews would arrive over the target to find the entire anchorage blanketed in artificial fog within minutes, generators on the shoreline pumping out smoke the instant enemy aircraft were detected. Fleet Air Arm strikes in April 1942 achieved nothing beyond losses of their own. The aging biplanes involved no match for the flak and fighter cover ranged against them. A large-scale carrier raid was judged too costly against defenses that included dense flak batteries ringing the anchorage and fighter cover within easy reach, and the home fleet could not risk its own capital ships venturing so close to shore-based Luftwaffe squadrons for the sake of a single target, however valuable. Conventional submarines, meanwhile, could not get close enough. The approaches to Kåfjord, where Tirpitz eventually based herself, were shallow, heavily mined and protected by anti-submarine nets stretching the width of the fjord, reinforced further by hydrophone listening posts and patrol boats making continuous sweeps of the water. A vessel the size of a standard T-class or S-class submarine, some 60 to 80 meters long and displacing well over 1,000 tons, simply could not maneuver through those defenses undetected. Its hull was too large to slip beneath the netting, its turning circle too wide for the confined waters, and its presence too easily picked up by listening equipment tuned for exactly that kind of intrusion. The frustration this caused within the Admiralty is difficult to overstate. Every month Tirpitz remained afloat, undamaged, was a month in which Britain's own battle fleet was effectively hostage to a ship that had barely fired a shot.
Planners calculated that neutralizing a single vessel moored in a Norwegian fjord could free up more naval strength than winning several smaller engagements combined. Yet nothing in the existing arsenal seemed capable of doing it. The Royal Navy needed something that could go where no normal submarine could follow, small enough to slip beneath nets, quiet enough to avoid hydrophones, maneuverable enough to thread minefields at walking pace, and expendable enough that losing one did not mean losing a trained crew of 60 men, along with millions of pounds of irreplaceable equipment. What they needed, in short, did not yet exist. The answer came from an unlikely partnership between the Admiralty and a small design team working under conditions of extreme secrecy at Vickers Armstrong's yard in Barrow-in-Furness, with early trials conducted from a base on Loch Striven in Scotland, known simply as HMS Varble. The man most closely associated with pushing the concept forward was Commander Cromwell Varley, a submarine officer who had championed the idea of tiny, human-crewed attack craft since before the war, though the finished X-craft was very much a collaborative effort refined through repeated trial and painful error. The resulting vessel, designated the X-craft, measured just over 15.5 meters in length, roughly the size of a single-decker bus, and displaced around 30 tons submerged, a fraction of the weight of a conventional attack submarine. Inside that cramped hull sat a crew of 4, a commanding officer, a first lieutenant who doubled as navigator, an engineer who managed the diesel and electric motors, and a diver whose job was to leave the vessel underwater to cut through anti-submarine nets. There was barely room to stand upright, no proper galley, no bunks beyond a single fold-down space, and a toilet arrangement so notoriously unpleasant that crews joked it was the most dangerous piece of equipment on board. Passage to the target could take days, with men living on chocolate, tinned food, and their own nerves, in an atmosphere growing steadily staler with every hour submerged. Condensation dripping constantly from the curved steel above their heads, the cold seeping in through the hull until breath itself began to fog inside the boat. Training for the program was carried out at HMS Varble on Loch Striven, a stretch of Scottish water chosen because its depth and layout resembled the fjords the crews would eventually have to navigate for real. Volunteers were drawn from across the submarine service, most barely into their 20s, and were warned frankly that the work ahead was among the most dangerous in the entire Royal Navy. Many did not pass selection. The claustrophobia, physical endurance, and sheer nerve required to operate inside a hole scarcely larger than a small caravan, often at depths where a single failure meant near certain death, was more than most men could sustain. Those who remained trained relentlessly in night approaches, net cutting, and diver escape, rehearsing the same maneuvers until they became instinctive because there would be no time to pause and think once the real operation began. The genius of the X-craft lay not in speed or firepower, but in method. Rather than firing torpedoes, each vessel carried 2 large explosive charges, known as side cargoes, mounted externally on either flank of the hull. Each charge contained roughly 2 tons of amatol explosive, comparable in destructive force to the payload of a heavy bomber's largest bomb, yet delivered not from the air, but placed by hand directly on the seabed beneath an enemy ship. The X-craft would creep beneath its target, release the charges to settle on the bottom, and withdraw, leaving behind a time fuse that would detonate hours later, long after the midget submarine and her crew had, with luck, slipped away. It was less a weapon of brute force than one of patience and precision, closer in spirit to a demolition team than a warship. Propulsion came from a small diesel engine on the surface and an electric motor underwater, giving a top speed of barely 6 or 7 knots, slower than a determined swimmer over short distances, which meant every approach had to be planned with almost surgical care, exploiting tides, darkness, and the blind spots of enemy lookouts. Because the X-craft lacked the range to cross the North Sea under their own power, each was towed into position by a full-size submarine, with the midget crew transferring aboard only for the final approach, exchanging places with a passage crew who had brought the vessel most of the way and would not take part in the attack itself.
It was during this towing phase, exposed on the surface of a hostile ocean for days at a stretch, that many of the earliest losses occurred. Boats lost to rough weather, flooding, or mechanical failure before they ever reached their target.
Sometimes with the loss of the entire crew and no clear record of exactly what went wrong. The tow itself demanded constant vigilance from both vessels. A parted tow rope in heavy seas could leave a midget submarine adrift and helpless hundreds of miles from friendly waters, its tiny batteries offering only a few hours of independent power. Manufacturing was carried out under wartime secrecy so tight that even the workers building the hulls at Barrow were often unaware of the finished vessel's true purpose, told only that they were constructing specialist naval equipment for trials. Components were frequently built in separate locations and assembled only at the final stage, a deliberate precaution against any single leak revealing the full shape of the program. Total production across the war years is generally put at around 20 vessels of the original X-craft type, with further examples of the improved X-E craft built later for service in the Far East, though precise figures remain difficult to pin down given how compartmentalized wartime records of the program were kept, and some archival gaps persist to this day. Operation Source, launched in September 1943, remains the defining moment of the X-craft story. 6 boats, designated X-5 through X-10, set out under tow to attack Tirpitz and 2 other German capital ships, Scharnhorst and Lützow, sheltering in Norwegian fjords. The passage alone was brutal. 2 craft were lost before reaching their targets, their fate never fully established, and a third was forced to abandon the mission after developing serious mechanical trouble. Of those that made it, X-6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, and X-7, commanded by Lieutenant Basil Place, succeeded in penetrating the netted anchorage at Kåfjord, navigating minefields and patrol boats with nerve that is difficult to overstate, at one point scraping along the sea floor to avoid detection before laying their charges directly beneath Tirpitz's hull. Both crews were captured shortly afterwards, their vessels scuttled or sunk, but the charges detonated exactly as planned, the eruption of water and pressure lifting the battleship bodily in the fjord. Accounts recorded after the war describe chaos aboard Tirpitz in the minutes that followed, officers convinced they were under attack from the air or from a full-sized submarine that had somehow slipped past every defense, unable to reconcile the scale of the damage with the absence of any visible attacker. The damage was severe enough to keep the battleship out of action for approximately 6 months and permanently degrade her fighting capability, warping propeller shafts, disabling turbines, and knocking out one of her main gun turrets entirely. Both Cameron and Place were awarded the Victoria Cross for an action fought entirely out of sight, with no witnesses beyond the enemy they had just outmaneuvered, and much of what is known about the final approach comes only from their own accounts and those of the German officers who later interrogated them, since no independent record of those final hours beneath the fjord survives. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is more of this story still to come. The X-craft program was not unique in concept. Germany experimented with its own midget submarines, the Biber and Mulch types, deployed in far greater numbers later in the war, but these were generally simpler single- or two-man vessels designed for coastal defense and torpedo attack rather than deliberate, planned infiltration of a defended anchorage, and German crews suffered heavy losses for comparatively modest results, hampered by poor seakeeping, rushed production, and pilots given only the barest minimum of training under increasingly desperate wartime conditions. Where the X-craft crews rehearsed a single, carefully chosen target for months, German midget submarine crews were frequently sent out in haste against whatever Allied shipping happened to be in range, a difference in approach that shows plainly in the results each program achieved. Italy's human torpedoes, the Mayal ridden by 2-man crews of the Decima Flotilla MAS, arguably came closest in spirit, having famously crippled 2 British battleships, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, at Alexandria in December 1941 by riding low in the water on what was effectively a piloted torpedo rather than a true submarine hull. The British program drew direct inspiration from that very attack, determined to prove the same tactic could be turned against its originators. The American approach differed again. The United States never fielded an equivalent midget submarine force, relying instead on conventional fleet submarines and, later, overwhelming carrier air power to deal with capital ship threats in the Pacific, a strategy suited to a theater of vast distances where stealthy infiltration of a defended fjord was rarely the problem at hand. What set the X-craft apart was less the underlying technology, since several nations pursued broadly similar ideas around the same time, than the specificity of its mission. Not coastal harassment or opportunistic strikes, but the deliberate, rehearsed neutralization of a single-named target sitting deep inside what its own navy considered an impregnable anchorage. No other nation's midget submarine program achieved a comparable strategic result against a major fleet unit. The material damage inflicted on Tirpitz was significant, but not, on its own, decisive. She was eventually repaired sufficiently to be moved south and was finally sunk in November 1944 by RAF Lancaster bombers using tallboy earthquake bombs, an attack made possible only because her reduced speed and unreliable machinery, legacies of the X-craft strike more than a year earlier, left her unable to maneuver out of danger as she once might have done. Yet the psychological and strategic impact of Operation Source is harder to dismiss than the tonnage figures alone might suggest. German commanders, previously confident in the security of their Norwegian anchorages, could no longer trust that distance and defended nets guaranteed safety, and additional resources, men, netting, patrol craft, were diverted to guarding fjords that had once been considered entirely beyond reach, resources that could otherwise have supported operations elsewhere. The program continued in improved form. The XE craft, used with great effect in the Far East against Japanese shipping, most notably in July 1945, when XE-3, under Lieutenant Ian Fraser, attacked the heavy cruiser Takao as she lay at anchor in the Johor Strait near Singapore. With the harbor patrolled and the water barely deep enough to submerge fully, diver-leading seaman James McGuinness left the craft to attach limpet charges beneath her hull under conditions of extreme danger, working in near-zero visibility against a rising tide while enemy sentries patrolled the deck above him. Both Fraser and McGuinness received the Victoria Cross for the action. Precisely how much of Takao's later fate can be attributed to that single attack remains debated by historians, since the cruiser had already suffered earlier damage from Allied submarines, but Japanese records confirm the vessel was left unable to move under her own power for the remainder of the war. Several X-craft and XE craft survive today, preserved at sites including the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, offering visitors a rare chance to stand beside a hull that once carried 4 men into the heart of an enemy fleet, close enough to appreciate just how little room there truly was inside, and just how much was asked of the men who volunteered to serve there. Kåfjord, Norway, morning of September 22, 1943. The water is calm again now, the violence of moments ago already settling into memory. On board Tirpitz, officers are still trying to understand what has happened, still searching the fjord for an enemy they will never see, because by the time the charges detonate, the men who placed them are already gone, captured, their tiny vessel scuttled beneath them. What they leave behind is not a sunken ship, not yet, but something arguably more valuable to the war effort, proof that no anchorage was truly safe, that no net, no minefield, no patrol line could guarantee security against an enemy small enough to slip through the gaps. That, in the end, is the real legacy of the X-craft. Not tonnage sunk, not headlines won, but a quiet, permanent erosion of certainty. For 4 years, the German Navy had built its northern strategy around the assumption that its capital ships were beyond reach while sheltering in fjords far from Allied airfields. After September 1943, that assumption was gone, and it never fully returned. 6 vessels went out that autumn. 2 returned nothing but silence. 2 others achieved what battleships and bombers had failed to achieve for a year and a half, and the men inside them did it crouched in hulls the size of a bus, breathing air that grew staler with every passing hour, navigating by dead reckoning through minefields they could not see. History remembers the big ships. It remembers Bismarck and Hood, Ark Royal and Prince of Wales, vessels whose names alone conjure images of scale and power, their silhouettes instantly recognizable even to people with only a passing interest in the war at sea. It remembers far less readily the 15 meters of steel that brought one of those giants to a standstill without firing a single shot in anger, without ever being seen by the crew it attacked, without a single enemy sailor able to say, honestly, what it was that had just struck them. The X-craft carried no guns worth the name, no torpedoes, no armor beyond the thin steel of the hull itself. What they carried was patience, precision, and 4 men willing to spend days folded into a space smaller than a small caravan, breathing recycled air, eating cold rations, for the chance to do quietly what an entire bomber force had failed to do with all the noise and weight of modern air power behind it. Consider what that actually meant in practice. A ship longer than a football pitch, protected by nets, mines, hydrophones, patrol boats, and thousands of trained men, was brought to a 6-month standstill by a vessel roughly the length of a bus, crewed by 4 men who could not stand upright inside their own boat. No radar detected them. No hydrophone operator raised the alarm in time. No patrol boat crossed their path at the critical moment. They simply went where the defenses assumed nothing could go, and left before anyone understood what had happened. That is not a small achievement dressed up in dramatic language. It is one of the most efficient uses of force in the entire naval war. A few tons of amatool and 4 volunteers achieving what squadrons of aircraft could not. It would be easy to close a story like this with certainty, to declare the X-craft the single decisive factor that ended the threat of Tirpitz once and for all. The historical record will not quite support that. She survived the attack, was patched and moved, and it took Lancaster bombers more than a year later to finally send her to the bottom. But certainty was never really the point. What Operation Source proved was something harder to quantify and, in its way, more valuable, that no anchorage, however remote or confidently guarded, could ever again be assumed safe. That single change in assumption shaped German decisions and diverted resources for the remainder of the war in ways no casualty figure will ever fully capture. Tirpitz was eventually sunk by aircraft more than a year later, in open water, in daylight, watched by crews who could see exactly what they were hitting. But it was 4 men in a boat no one saw coming, working in darkness beneath a hostile fjord, who broke her first and broke, with her, the illusion that any warship, however vast, however heavily defended, was ever truly beyond reach. That is the story the X-craft leaves behind. Not the sinking of a battleship, but the quiet, permanent proof that nothing built by man is ever entirely safe from 4 men, a small steel hull, and the patience to wait for the right moment to strike.